I want to thank the Chinese Historical Society of New England for this great honor. Last year, when we gathered at the Empire Garden Restaurant, we heard about the remarkable achievements of the 2019 Sojourner honorees, Helen Chin Schlichte and Yu Sing Jung. I want to take this opportunity to thank Helen and Yu Sing for all that you've done and all that you are doing. And it's a great honor for me to join you as Sojourner honorees. It's also a real pleasure to share this night with Dr. Robert Yuan and to recognize your tremendous achievement in the founding of GBCCA. While we were working so hard in Chinatown, we knew of the important work you were doing in the suburbs. And I hope that all of us continue to work together as one community. So congratulations, Dr. Yuan. In keeping with the mission of CHSNE as a historical society, I thought I would share some of my family history with you tonight. Unfortunately, my family has not been as disciplined about preserving our family history as we should have been. So much of what you're going to hear is family lore. But I can tell you that in putting together this brief history, I've really developed a greater appreciation for the importance of the mission of CHSNE. So thank you for all you're doing to preserve our historical records. And as you're going to hear tonight, my family's story is really the classic American immigration story of perseverance and sacrifice. Immigrants seeking opportunity for themselves, but most of all for future generations like me. So we'll start the story with my great-grandfather on my father's side. Family lore has it that my great-grandfather was a stowaway on a boat from China, and that he swam to shore in San Francisco with no documentation. Like other immigrants with no papers, he blended into Chinatown and supporting himself with odd jobs. A few years later, after the 1906 earthquake destroyed much of San Francisco, including the immigration building, he came forward, like many other undocumented immigrants, and asked for his immigration records. This is how he became documented. Family lore has it that he worked on the railroads and eventually made his way to Boston, where he opened a hand laundry in Watertown. He worked basically 24/7, living in the back of the store, and sent money home to support his family back in the village. Over time, he brought his son, my grandfather, over to help in the laundry, and then my father. But my great-grandfather was a true sojourner. He always intended to go back to China, and he did manage to return to live out the rest of his days there. My grandfather also intended to be a sojourner, but living the lonely life in the back of the laundry, he fell into some of the vices that we've all heard about: gambling, smoking, excessive alcohol. But as far as we know, no opium or drugs. And tragically, he died of a heart attack in Boston in 1951 at the relatively young age of 49 before he could go back. My father came in 1939 at the age of 13 to work in the laundry. The hard work, lack of friends because he didn't speak English, and the harshness of laundry life resulted in many lonely nights. And because he was under 16, he was required to go to school. And of course, in those days, there was no such thing as English as a second language classes. So at the age of 13, he was put in with the kindergartners. And he made it through the second grade with this class before quitting just as soon as he turned 16. He continued to work in the laundry until he entered the US Army toward the end of World War II. He served stateside, never making it overseas, but he was very proud of his service. He was one of 2 Chinese Americans in his troop, and we can see from the official troop picture that almost everyone in the troop was a full head taller than the 2 of them. I'm sure you've seen the wonderful book, Unsung Heroes, the historical record of the military service of Chinese Americans during World War II. I want to give a shout out to the author, William Chen, for this wonderful work of preserving this important history of Chinese Americans. Because my father served in the military, The War Brides Act permitted him to bring his wife into this country after the war, despite the restrictive immigration rules. So he went back to China and married my mother in an arranged marriage. According to family lore, he went back with a list of 10 names, and my mother was number 2 on the list. Family lore doesn't tell us what happened with number 1. My father was 21 and my mother was 19, Richard and Chow Lee. I often think of what it must have been like for my mother to move from the village where she spent her whole life halfway around the world to live with a man she barely knew in a small apartment together with my grandfather. Although my grandfather was living a life of loneliness and excess, my mother said he was very nice to her. At that time, there were very few women in Chinatown, and the older wives took on the role of mentors and friends for younger ones like my mother. We were so poor that we moved 4 times within Chinatown before I was 6 years old. But there was a shared community because so many other families were in the same situation. Many of us would be out on the stoops of our row houses on Hudson Street in those pre-air conditioning days, and it felt like you knew the whole neighborhood. Certainly all the mothers were watching our every move and reporting any misbehavior to our parents. It was this sense of community that provided support for my parents, a job network, English language classes, and assistance in accessing social services when they were needed. By the time I was born, my father had closed the restaurant and was working in Chinese restaurants. Because he spoke some English, he didn't have to work in the back of the house in the kitchen. And one of the highlight memories for us growing up was when he was a waiter at the Cathay House, which is now the hot pot restaurant at the end of Beach Street near Gateway Park. At that time, Cathay House was Boston's most fancy Chinese restaurant. And in those days, Boston closed up early. And anyone wanting a late night bite after a show or a sporting event would go to Chinatown, where the restaurant stayed open late. My father waited on many celebrities over the years. I remember the time he came home and asked us if we had heard of someone named Frank Sinatra. And then with a twinkle in his eye, he produced a signed program. While we were in school in those days, we mostly saw him just once a week on Monday, his one day off, for family dinner when he would cook up a feast of Chinese food. And for all of you listening tonight, you all know that this is the Chinese way of showing their love, by feeding you. In total, my father worked this schedule of 12-hour days, 6 days a week, for over 50 years before retiring in his 70s. My mother was a garment worker in sewing factories around Boston, including on the 5th floor of the China Trade Building where CHSNE is located. The factories were hot and noisy. They're called sweatshops for a reason. But she really enjoyed being with the other Chinese ladies and the other immigrant ladies. She often came home and tried out some Portuguese, Italian, or some other language she learned at the shop. When I was 6, my family bought a rundown row house on Ash Street next to a boarding house for men, many of whom were drunk most of the time. Although we fixed the house up, it was not the most desirable location because the other side of the street was where the Orange Line came barreling out of the downtown tunnel and climbed toward the elevated tracks on Washington Street. I attended the old Quincy School on Tyler Street, where CCBA is now located. And while I was there in the late 1950s, the student body was mostly 100% Chinese. During that time, the Chinatown neighborhood was being torn apart by eminent domain, takings of homes and whole streets. First for the construction of the Southeast Expressway, and then the Massachusetts Turnpike extension. In addition, institutional expansion by Tufts Medical Center wiped out our neighborhood around Ash Street. Most families moved to the South End, which was nearby and within walking distance of Chinatown. But my parents opted instead to move out into the suburbs in Brookline so that my brother Tom and my sister Liz and I could attend the good schools there. For me, this began my journey to find my way in the mainstream world. Like my parents, I had to work hard. I had to learn new cultures. I had to find support, allies, mentors, all the while holding on to what was really important to me. And that was family, friends, and giving back to communities like Chinatown that helped my family so much, or at least paying it forward to new immigrants arriving here. This is the reason for my commitment to community work. I had the privilege of working with such dedicated community leaders as Caroline Chang, Neil Chin, and Tunny Lee, all co-founders of CHSNE, but I worked with them to co-found the Asian Community Development Corporation, which over the last 30 years has built affordable housing in Chinatown and worked to make the neighborhood vibrant and livable, to bring back some of the old Chinatown where we all benefited from helping each other find our way in a new land. I'm particularly proud that ACDC built affordable housing at the Metropolitan on the lot where we used to live on Ash Street, and at One Greenway where we used to live on Hudson Street. Over the years, I've been fortunate to have mentors and allies help me achieve success in my professional life as a lawyer. That's a longer story for another day, but I feel so fortunate during my professional life to have been to the White House to meet with President Clinton in the Oval Office, to have been president of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, NAPABA, which represents the interests of over 40,000 Asian American lawyers around the country, and to have been a member of the Board of Governors of the American Bar Association, and even to have been invited to the Queen's Garden Party at Buckingham Palace. To have gone from being a kid running around the streets of Chinatown to being a partner at a major law firm in the financial district just a mile away. All this I owe to the hard work and sacrifice of my immigrant ancestors, my great-grandfather, the Sojourner, my grandfather who wanted to be a Sojourner but never made it home, and my parents who decided to settle in this country as an American family. And I'm grateful for my own family, my wife, Mary, whose immigrant family is also the embodiment of the American dream. They had a hand laundry in Davis Square in Somerville, where many of the customers were Tufts professors. When she entered Tufts as an undergraduate, many of her professors recognized her. She went on to medical school at Tufts, intern and residency at Tufts Medical Center, teaching at Tufts Medical School, becoming Dean for Education, as well as Associate Provost for the entire university back in Medford. And we're so proud of our son, Greg, a tech software entrepreneur on the West Coast, and our daughter, Samantha, a public interest lawyer advocating for the rights of women in New York City. I hope that people can look at our family, like so many families who are supporting CHSNE tonight, and see the power of immigration to enable newcomers and their children to achieve the American dream, and to help make this country a world leader in science, technology, and moral and ethical leadership. I hope that this country will continue to value immigrants for all they can do to advance the greatness of our nation. So thank you once again to CHSNE for keeping our history alive, and thank you very much for this Sojourner Award.